Well, here we are in Chapter 17. Chapter 17 takes a look at art in Northern Europe in about the same era as Chapter 16, in the 1500s. The techniques of the Renaissance didn't percolate north as fast as they did throughout Italy. And in this chapter, we start taking a look at Germany and Holland and how they may be picking up some of the elements of Renaissance art, but maybe in kind of a slow and grudging way. We start by looking at architecture, and as Gombrich points out, what happened in these areas was that architects were, let's say, encouraged to include elements of Renaissance architecture by their patrons, but some of them seemed to do it in a way that was still trying to preserve some Gothic architecture. So they would put elements of Renaissance architecture, which really were a revival of Greek and Roman art forms, into what were essentially Gothic buildings, but they would apply them as kind of cosmetic features. So there's some interesting pictures and discussion by Gombrich on that. We also take a look at the engraved art of Albrecht Durer and the watercolor that he did. Durer was a very famous engraver, a very capable artist. He attempted to do things with engraving and etching that were quite masterful, but he seemed to have a desire to have a formulaic technique for laying out figures in some of his work. And you'll see an engraving of Adam and Eve that looks as if he did apply a formula to how he structured those bodies. So in a way, it looks just slightly artificial. And Gombrich will tell you a little bit more about that. Then we take a look at an artist that we know very little about. He's called Grunewald, but we think his name was Nithard. He painted only a very few paintings. The significant thing about them is he did adopt some techniques of the Renaissance, light perspective, and various other techniques that he seemed to use selectively. It seemed that his interest was really in presenting the religious story that he painted. He also carried over some of the techniques of the Middle Ages. So his art, which Gombrich discusses in this chapter, really is a good example of the transition between one era and another, and how some particularly capable artists would include features of the new art style, but meld them in a significant way and in a very artful way with some of the old techniques of the era just ending. And finally, this chapter concludes with an example of art that was labeled Mannerist. Mannerist is an attempt to portray something in a manner of a prior artist, sort of an affected way of doing it. And it was a technique where the earlier artist's manner of painting was attempted to be replicated by an artist, almost as if the artist doing this was attempting to achieve the same amount of greatness by copying the same style. There's a painting in particular of St. Luke as an artist painting the Virgin Mary and Jesus. If you look at the surroundings of it, you'll see it's a very strange painting because the surroundings have nothing to do with the subject matter that's being pictured. It's affected in that way. It's kind of an attempt to do something that an artist in a prior era did, but it's phony in the way that it seems to be an insincere effort at picturing something, almost as if the picture is being painted so that the artist can demonstrate a skill in linear perspective in this case, where it doesn't meet the requirements of the subject matter. So phony in that way. Very tough era here following the Renaissance artists, and some artists did adopt this Mannerist type of style. I call your attention also to the end of the chapter where Hieronymus Bosch is discussed, and some of the artworks that he painted that were quite well accepted in Spain, which was a much more conservative Catholic country even during the Renaissance and beyond. So the type of moralistic painting he does there, where he imagines what heaven and imagines what hell is like, starts leading into a type of painting, a genre of painting, which becomes moralistic. And we'll see a further development in subsequent chapters.